Hi everyone. So today I wanted to get you started just with some of the common words, phrases that we use within our yoga practice that maybe you've heard within a class, and maybe some of them are familiar to you, maybe some of them you know, but actually you're not 100% sure what the teacher means. So hopefully today we'll just clear up some of those things. So you're welcome to practice along with me, or you can watch the video and then maybe try these at another time. So the first one that we'll often hear within a yoga practice is our tabletop position. So what does that mean? Essentially, it means creating a tabletop with your spine, so your back. So we come into this all fours position. So our knees are underneath our hips here and our hands are underneath our shoulders. And what we want to do is try to avoid any dipping through the spine, either this way or this way. So instead we're looking for that neutral spine so we can keep everything in this nice solid tabletop position. Now this is often used as a transition posture, so maybe we'll say from child's pose, come up to tabletop, then we begin our cat-cows from here. So it can be a transition posture, but what I invite you to do is also see it as a posture in itself. It can be active and it can really help to bring some awareness into the core, but also help to stabilize the shoulders. So when you come into maybe our thread the needle, if you're reaching through, if you're reaching up, then that arm that's still on the floor, you feel nice and stabilized, nice and strong, you're not too wobbly. So if we come back into our tabletop here, to stabilize the shoulders, we spread the fingers nice and wide and we press down through the ground. And it's that winding action, so almost like you're trying to spin the hands to the outside of the mat. And notice what your elbows do. So once I create that stability, activate those shoulders, the elbow starts to point behind me, so in towards my body, and my elbow pit starts to point forward. That is going to create that nice stable position. I'm pressing my knees down into the ground as well, keeping this nice solid position. So then I can easily release one hand, release the other, I can even release the feet, rather than just sort of hanging out in this position, and then if I was to release that hand, I'm a lot more wobbly. So I invite you with your tabletop, as I said, to think of it as a posture in itself, to maybe use that more active tabletop, rather than just seeing it as a fluid movement as you're moving into the next posture. So that's our tabletop. So the next one we're going to talk through is our feet. And you'll hear through a lot of classes, the teacher will cue you to maybe point your toes or flex your toes, or even talk about dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So what does that mean? So if we're talking about pointing the toes, it's effectively pointing the toes away from us to create that long length through the back of the body here. That is what we also call plantar flexion, so planting your feet. If we're talking about flexing, pointing the toes towards us, then we're really activating the back of the leg, maybe getting a nice stretch through the back of the calf. And that's also our dorsiflexion, so pulling the toes towards us. So pointing the feet, plantar flexion, flexing the feet, that's taking it into that dorsiflexion. So that is our feet, maybe some common cues that you've heard there. So the next one is going to be our pelvis. I'm going to demonstrate this in our tabletop position. We often talk a lot about tucking our pelvis, untucking our pelvis, or neutral pelvis. So I'll just demonstrate in this tabletop position, and then hopefully you'll be able to see the movement here. Just making sure you can see the pelvis, okay? I'll come into my tabletop position here. Again, I'm nice and active. So if I take myself into a neutral pelvis, so I've got this slight round through the spine, which is just my natural rounding through the lower back here. So this is my neutral pelvis. If I take it into anterior tilt, anterior with an A, then I tilt the pelvis forward. Notice my bottom starts sticking up to the sky. I'm getting a deeper bend there in the lower back. If I take it into a posterior tilt, this is where I'm tucking the tailbone, rounding through that lower back. So anterior, tilting forward, untucking the tailbone, or posterior, rounding through the lower back, tucking the tailbone. So this is when often teachers will say, drawing the belly or sucking the belly. In fact, it's more of that tilt of the pelvis rather than just pulling the belly in. If I demonstrate more from a seated position, because this is often where our pelvis tilts come into play. So if we're more in a posterior tilt, so my hip bones are facing backwards, I'm rounding through that lower back, it's going to be really difficult for me to fold forward. I'm essentially having to get around this curve to even fold forward in the same place. If I just take it into a neutral spine, so got that natural rounding through the spine, sitting up nice and tall, I have a bit more space here to fold. However, if I'm able to take, especially with forward folds, and we'll talk through this a lot when we fold forward, if I can take it already into that anterior tilt, so tucking the pelvis forward, and this is often when teachers will use the cue, remove the flash from your bottom, and that really means finding those sitting bones, taking that pelvis already into that slight anterior tilt, so the hip bones start to face forward. Then I'm already in that hinge position, so it's much easier for me to fold forward here by keeping this nice straight spine as well. Often this is challenging, so this is where I say to my students, grab a block, sit up higher, and then we can already initiate that tilt of the pelvis, so that anterior tilting forward before we even begin to fold. And if tilting the pelvis forward or backward, anterior, posterior is confusing, think of a bucket of water. The bucket of water is your pelvis. As you tilt forward, the water comes forward and we start to get that tilt of the water forward. So we're bringing the front side down, the water flows over to that front side. If we take it back to neutral, then that water is flat. If we take it into the posterior tilt, so the hip bones start to come up, we tilt that water back. So this time it's sloping down to that side. So neutral, anterior tilt, and a posterior tilt. So it's worth just playing around. Kneeling position or standing can be a really good way of doing this. So we've got neutral, we've got anterior tilt, and we've got posterior tilt. So just get used to that movement of your pelvis, getting used to how it moves. So I hope that helps. We've talked through tabletop, we've talked through our feet and ankles, pointing the toes, flexing the toes, and we've talked through the movement of the pelvis as well.